February 1943, the North Atlantic. From the port of Liverpool, Convoy ON 166 set out for North America. It consisted of 45 merchant vessels carrying ammunition, food, and fuel. Escort protection was provided by the Royal Canadian Navy, the destroyer HMCS Dauphin, and the corvettes Chilliwack, Rosthern, Trillium, and Dauphin. The mission was simple in definition, but critical in consequence: to cross the Atlantic safely through waters dominated by German U-boats. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its critical phase. Allied shipping losses exceeded 600,000 tons per month. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's submarine fleet, was convinced that unrestricted submarine warfare could strangle Britain into submission. U-boats operated in coordinated Wolfpacks, hunting at night and guided by intercepted radio traffic. A single error in transmission could expose an entire convoy. Convoy ON 166 departed on 11th of February 1943. Communication was strictly limited, short encrypted bursts transmitted at preset intervals. Every signal was a risk. On 20th of February at 21:40 hours, amid a severe gale reaching force 9, the convoy command issued an order to change course from 260 degrees to 275 degrees, avoiding an iceberg field reported south of the route. On board the American freighter SS Collingsworth, the duty radio operator was Harold Stevens, 27, a civilian wireless technician drafted into service in 1941. According to post-war crew accounts, Stevens had been awake for nearly 2 days without rest. The radio shack was damp, freezing, and vibrating with the noise of the engines. A bottle of rum stood on the table, officially for warmth, unofficially a common practice among long-range crews. Fatigue and alcohol were a frequent combination during winter crossings. While preparing the encoded transmission, Stevens misentered the course data. Instead of 275 degrees, he transmitted 250 degrees. A 25-degree deviation, unnoticed in the chaos of static and storm. The bridge officer confirmed receipt without cross-checking. The entry in Collingsworth's radio log read 20:02:43, 21:47. Message sent. Course 250 confirmed. Hours later, the message was intercepted by the German B-Dienst signals unit in Hamburg. For their analysts, it was clear evidence of a large Allied convoy moving northwest. The decoded report reached Admiral Dönitz's headquarters. Convoy ON, course 250 degrees, expected in grid AK-57. Dönitz immediately ordered the concentration of Wolfpack Stürmer, 14 submarines, into that sector. Their target was a convoy that, in fact, would never appear there. The real ON 166 was moving farther south, battered by the storm. Communications remained erratic. Escorts received no feedback confirming the correction. The missent coordinates, caused by exhaustion and likely alcohol, would redirect the entire German attack effort into empty ocean. In later naval circles, the incident became a quiet legend, the drunk radio operator who saved a fleet. 21st February 1943. Convoy ON 166 was positioned roughly at 52 degrees north, 30 degrees west. Average speed, 7 knots. Sea state, heavy. Winds reached 17 meters per second, waves up to 7 meters. Air temperature hovered around -3 degrees Celsius. The storm had persisted for more than 30 hours, reducing visibility to less than a mile. On the bridge of HMCS Dauphin, Commander R.W. Hart noted in his log, "Formation holding, visibility near zero, radio interference severe." Throughout the convoy, the situation was the same. The howling wind overloaded antennas, the salt spray short-circuited connections, and static bursts rendered most transmissions unreadable. Each ship was equipped with Type 89 shortwave sets, operating between 8 and 12 MHz. Under normal conditions, they maintained contact with escorts twice daily. In this weather, they barely transmitted at all. At 04:15 GMT, the Dauphin's signals officer issued a confirmation order, repeating the course of 275 degrees, encrypted using the standard Royal Navy short burst cipher. Only part of the message reached the convoy. Several ships logged garbled text strings, and SS Collingsworth recorded, "Order received partially, unable to confirm coordinates, awaiting repetition." Harold Stevens tried 3 times to re-establish the link. His signal reports showed increasing interference. The noise level on the receiver exceeded the tone of the code itself. The logbook noted, "Severe QRN, transmission repeated unsuccessfully." By 05 o'clock, the Collingsworth navigator observed that their dead reckoning track was drifting southwest under wind pressure. The discrepancy with the last radioed coordinates amounted to roughly 25 degrees. Because the ship was struggling to maintain heading, the bridge decided to hold course until further instructions from the escort. Meanwhile, 1,000 kilometers to the east, German cryptanalysts at Dönitz Hamburg began cross-referencing intercepted Allied signals. At 06:30 Berlin time, they logged a new transmission, matching the format of convoy position updates. Within minutes, the data reached the U-boat command headquarters in Kiel. The decoded summary read, "Large convoy, probable ON series, bearing 250 degrees, proceeding northwest, estimated in grid AK-57. At 09 o'clock, Admiral Dönitz received the intercept analysis. The course matched the one transmitted, incorrectly, by Collingsworth. Believing the data accurate, Dönitz ordered the Stürmer group, consisting of 14 submarines, including U-603, U-186, U-604, and U-606, to converge on the predicted track. Estimated interception window, the night of 22nd February. In the North Atlantic, the weather continued to worsen. 3 merchant vessels, E.K. Carson, Pan Atlantic, and Empire Trader, temporarily lost contact with the main formation. Only intermittent radio bursts confirmed their presence. By noon, wind velocity reached 10 on the Beaufort scale. Several masts sustained minor damage. Aerial wires snapped under tension. Across the escort ships, radio operators attempted to keep a continuous watch. Noise levels on the shortwave bands remained extreme. The sound described in technical notes as electric crackling. At 2300, Harold Stevens performed another scheduled transmission, reporting weather conditions and convoy status. No acknowledgement was received. The transmission vanished into static. In London, the Admiralty's Western Approaches Command registered irregularities in the convoy's reports. Radio triangulation failed to determine its position. At 01:30 on the 22nd, the duty officer entered a brief note in report ON-1662. Contact with convoy intermittent due to atmospheric interference and suspected equipment failure. For the next 24 hours, neither side knew the other's position. The convoy drifted westward through storm-torn seas, following its last known heading. The Wolfpack, guided by incorrect coordinates from one exhausted, half-intoxicated operator, was now advancing into empty ocean. 22nd February 1943, North Atlantic. At dawn, the storm still showed no sign of breaking. Convoy ON-166 continued westward, spread over nearly 30 nautical miles of turbulent sea. The ships could barely see one another through the freezing spray. Only the rhythmic flashes of signal lamps and the faint hum of engines kept them coordinated. To the men aboard, it felt like isolation in motion, each vessel a drifting island, blind and deaf under the roar of the gale. The Bedienst Intercept Center in Hamburg, however, believed otherwise. Their analysts had already confirmed what they thought was a major Allied convoy, moving northwest on a heading of 250 degrees. At 0400 Berlin time, an encrypted summary was transmitted to U-boat command in Kiel. Within an hour, Admiral Dönitz issued Operation Order No. 1185, directing Gruppe Stürmer, 14 submarines under the tactical coordination of Kapitän-Leutnant Gunther Prinz, to converge on grid AK-57, roughly 600 nautical miles south of Iceland. Each U-boat received its specific patrol pattern. U-603 would approach from the northeast, U-186 from the west, U-606 and U-609 sweeping from the south. The submarines surfaced to maximize speed, 12 to 14 knots, and to recharge batteries before the expected night engagement. The men aboard had spent the previous week submerged for long stretches, enduring condensation, diesel fumes, and cold that seeped through their oilskins. Spirits rose at the prospect of action. They believed the hunt was certain. Meanwhile, Convoy ON-166 was nowhere near grid AK-57. Because of the incorrect radio message sent from SS Collingsworth, the Wolfpack was chasing ghosts. The real convoy had continued roughly 200 kilometers south of the reported position, its course obscured by violent seas and total radio silence. Only fragments of transmissions occasionally reached the escort flagship HMCS Dauphin, which continued to repeat orders for formation integrity and sonar vigilance. No one on board realized that their own signals, distorted by interference, still reflected the erroneous coordinates. German expectation. At 12:30 hours, U-186 radioed to headquarters. No contact. Heavy swell, visibility poor. Proceeding to square AK-57. This was logged by the BDU War Diary, Kriegstagebuch der Uboatführung. Another message from U-606 arrived at 14:10. Detected distant propeller noise bearing 210 degrees. Range uncertain. Possible convoy. The sound was, in fact, a meteorological echo, a false reading produced by pressure changes and the booming resonance of waves along the thermocline. Nevertheless, Dönitz's staff interpreted it as confirmation of the convoy's presence. He responded with a terse order. Maintain pursuit. Engage by nightfall. The U-boats continued to chase the phantom signal through a storm that crippled even their communication systems. Surface waves reached 8 meters. Hydrophones were virtually useless, and radar, still in its primitive stage aboard German submarines, provided almost no return in such conditions. At 2000, the Wolfpack commander reported, "Visibility nil, no contact, proceeding as planned." Inside the conning tower of U-603, sailors stood in water up to their ankles, listening to the endless pounding on the hull. They believed they were hours away from intercepting a 40-ship Allied formation. In reality, the nearest merchant vessel was more than 150 nautical miles away. The Allied position. While the Germans searched empty ocean, the convoy itself continued through extreme weather south of the predicted route. On SS Collingsworth, radio operator Harold Stevens remained on duty. The ship's first officer later recalled that the radio room smelled strongly of oil, ozone, and alcohol. In the morning watch log appears a brief annotation, "Operator fatigued. Performance adequate, though slurred." Stevens transmitted a short situation report, again using outdated positional data. His exhausted attempt to correct the earlier error resulted in another garbled coordinate string. The message was never received, and thus never corrected. The Admiralty's listening stations in Northern Ireland marked it as unintelligible, partial carrier only. By this point, the convoy had drifted deeper into the storm belt. The sea state offered unexpected protection. Radar reflections were useless to U-boats, sonar detection ranges collapsed to under 600 meters, and Allied aircraft patrols were grounded by weather. Statistically, the worst possible conditions for navigation had become the best possible defense. The German frustration. For the Wolfpack, the situation became increasingly desperate. On 23 February, at 0200 hours, U-186 reported heavy fuel consumption due to continuous surface running. By dawn, several submarines had lost visual contact with one another. Their coordination collapsed. The BDU staff in Kiel noted in the War Diary, "Group Stürmer reports failure to locate convoy despite intercept certainty. Possible radio deception or change of course." In his post-war memoirs, Dönitz would later acknowledge that this episode marked one of the first indications that Allied radio discipline and deception tactics were improving. What he never knew was that the entire misdirection had been the result of a single numeric error, produced by one overworked operator under the influence of rum. The psychological effect on the crews was severe. Several U-boats reported exhaustion and seasickness after 72 hours of futile search. U-603's chief engineer recorded, "Men demoralized, sea unmanageable, no target, no result. Fuel reserves dwindled. The Wolfpack was ordered to withdraw east to refuel near Saint-Nazaire. By the time they turned back, ON-166 had already crossed the critical danger zone unscathed." Allied awareness. Within Allied command, the absence of attacks went largely unnoticed. Only later did Western Approaches Command remark on the unusual calm. The signal summary dated 24th February reads, "No U-boat contact recorded. Weather conditions likely deterrent." In fact, it was not the weather alone. It was one man, fatigued, slightly drunk, seated in a dim radio cabin aboard SS Collingsworth, whose error shifted the entire enemy search grid hundreds of miles off course. The Battle of the Atlantic was full of such invisible moments. No medals were awarded, no official mention made. But among the men who later recalled the story, the phrase persisted. The drunk radio operator who saved a fleet. 24th February 1943. The storm finally began to break over the mid-Atlantic. Skies cleared in narrow bands, leaving a rough grey sea still rolling with 6-metre swells. Convoy ON-166, now spread over 70 nautical miles, reorganised formation under Commander R.W. Hart aboard HMCS Dauphin. The ships were exhausted but intact. For the first time in 4 days, visual contact between escorts was re-established. In the Allied Western Approaches Command at Derby House, Liverpool, intelligence officers noted an anomaly. For more than 48 hours, not a single U-boat sighting had been reported. No distress calls, no flares, no Wolfpack attacks. An unprecedented calm. The duty analyst, Lieutenant A.M. Pearson, recorded, "Either enemy submarines are absent from sector, or we are in a blind spot of exceptional scale." Unknown to them, the blind spot was not geographic but accidental. The Stürmer group, misled by the faulty intercept from SS Collingsworth, had spent 2 full nights sweeping empty ocean. Their sonar operators strained to distinguish echoes of icebergs from imaginary propeller beats. The fuel situation aboard several boats became critical. German confusion. At 0300 hours on 24th February, U-186 transmitted, "No convoy contact, visibility 2 miles, returning to base for refuel." Dönitz's staff at Kiel received similar messages from U-606, U-624 and U-607. The war diary of the BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, for that date reads, "Group Stürmer engaged in fruitless pursuit. Assumption, convoy changed course south after interception notice. No success." The official explanation attributed failure to Allied evasion tactics, not to faulty German intelligence. Analysts in Hamburg concluded that their radio intercepts had likely been masked by atmospheric distortion. The possibility of an Allied transmission error was not considered. The precision of B-Dienst decoding was viewed as absolute. What they never suspected was that the transmission itself had been accidentally falsified at the source by one operator under fatigue and mild intoxication. A missed confrontation. Historical data reconstructed after the war show how close both sides came to contact. At midnight on 22nd February, ON-166's southernmost ships were less than 180 nautical miles from the northern patrol line of U-603. Had the weather improved 12 hours earlier, radar or visual sighting might have occurred. Instead, the storm's noise floor on Allied sonar exceeded 90 decibels, rendering detection impossible beyond half a kilometre. The same interference also blinded the U-boats. By the time skies cleared, both forces had already passed each other on divergent bearings, one heading west, the other northeast, separated by nearly 200 miles of empty sea. Naval historians would later call it a collision of vectors without intersection. A major convoy battle was expected. None took place. What should have been another grim chapter of the tonnage war simply vanished from the operational record. The aftermath at sea. When ON-166 regrouped on 25th of February, several ships reported minor damage. Bent stanchions, flooded holds, a cracked rudder pin on Pan-Atlantic, but there were no losses. Radio communications were restored, escorts resumed standard watch schedules. In the evening, Commander Hart sent a routine transmission to Liverpool, confirming the convoy's position at 55 degrees north, 37 degrees west. It reached western approaches without interference, the first clear signal in 3 days. In his brief report, Hart wrote, "No U-boat contact. Weather primary factor of survival." He could not know that the real factor was a human mistake logged 70 hours earlier in the radio room of Collingsworth. The drunk operator's legacy. Records from the Collingsworth crew list note that Harold Stevens was relieved of duty after the voyage. The official cause: operational fatigue and minor disciplinary breach involving spirits. No inquiry connected his actions to the convoy's survival. Among seamen, however, the story spread quickly, an anecdote of irony during an unforgiving war. By mid-1943, when Dönitz shifted his U-boat strategy to the mid-Atlantic gap, intelligence officers in the Royal Navy's Operational Intelligence Centre, OIC, reviewed anomalies from previous convoys. File OIC ON 166 contains a single marginal note. German Wolfpack mispositioned due to faulty Allied transmission, cause undetermined. That faulty transmission had spared 45 ships and over 1,000 men. In an ocean war where errors usually meant death, this one delivered safety. Perspective. The incident of ON 166 stands as an understated episode of the Battle of the Atlantic, a demonstration of how warfare depends not only on weapons and plans, but on frail human endurance. A tired operator, working through noise, cold, and fear, pressed the wrong key. The consequences rippled through thousands of miles of sea, across enemy command networks, and into the fabric of history. No decoration was ever issued, and no mention entered the Admiralty's victory reports. Yet for those who later studied the decrypted archives, it remained a quiet reminder. In the calculus of war, error itself can become a weapon. When the storm finally broke, the Atlantic was unrecognizable. The water had turned a dull steel grey, calm but restless, breathing slowly after 3 days of chaos. Waves rolled under a pale sky streaked with low clouds, and every ship that survived looked battered, streaked with salt, its crew hollow-eyed and silent. Convoy on 166, spread thin across miles of rough water, began to regroup. The escorts signalled to the freighters, checking positions, counting hulls, confirming that the sea had not taken anyone. Somehow, everyone was still there. None of the sailors knew that far to the northeast, in a room filled with cigarette smoke and maps smeared with grease pencil, Admiral Karl Dönitz was staring at a chart that made no sense. 14 U-boats of the Stürmer group had been deployed in a perfect arc, closing what should have been the convoy's only escape route. Every calculation was correct, every radio intercept confirmed, but the ocean was empty. The Wolfpack had been hunting for 2 nights in darkness and heavy swell, surfacing through ice-cold spray, scanning horizons that offered nothing but the glint of distant waves. The sonar operators strained to catch propeller noise beneath the roaring sea, hearing only their own engines echoing back from the depths. By dawn on the 24th of February, one of the captains, Captain Lieutenant Reimers of U-606, broke radio silence. His message was brief, stripped of excuses. No contact, storm conditions, convoy not present. Others followed within hours. The reports reached Kiel, where Dönitz read them in silence before placing his pipe down and calling for his analysts. He refused to believe in chance. If the convoy wasn't there, it meant the British had changed their codes, or that Allied intelligence had used some new form of deception. What he didn't know, what no one on his staff could imagine, was that the entire failure of the operation traced back to a single, overworked American radio operator, shivering in the middle of the Atlantic, who had entered one wrong number after too many hours without sleep and a few too many swallows of rum. In Hamburg, the cryptanalysts of B-Dienst rechecked the data. The Allied transmissions they had captured were clear, the code correctly broken, the coordinates perfectly aligned with earlier estimates. The data was impeccable. The only flaw lay in the original signal itself, but to the Germans, the idea that the enemy's own mistake could mislead them was almost unthinkable. Their science, their discipline, their trust in mathematics blinded them to the absurdity that had just occurred. The Atlantic, as ever, favoured no one. It simply played its games of coincidence and fatigue. Out at sea, the men of ON 166 went about their work, still unaware that the greatest danger had already passed them by. The crews attributed their survival to luck, to the storm, to God, to anything but human error. Aboard the freighter SS Collingsworth, Harold Stevens sat alone in his small radio cabin. The air smelled of oil, dust, and the bitter sweetness of cheap liquor. He stared at the transmitter's dull glow as if it could tell him what had gone wrong. He remembered the storm, the howling wind, the static that had swallowed his words. Perhaps the message hadn't gone through, he thought. Perhaps it hadn't mattered. He didn't know that his missent course had thrown 14 submarines into a fruitless hunt hundreds of miles away. As the sky cleared, the convoy tightened its formation. The Canadian destroyer HMCS Dauphin re-established communications, and the scattered ships slowly fell back into their columns. No attacks, no torpedo wakes, no alarms. Commander Hart, writing in his nightly report, simply noted that the weather was the principal factor in avoiding enemy contact. He couldn't have been more wrong. Yet his sentence wasn't entirely false. The weather had played its role. It had hidden not the ships, but the consequences of a man's mistake. 2 months later, when Allied intelligence reviewed decrypted Enigma reports, the story finally surfaced. The German war diary for February recorded the failure of Stürmer Group to locate a convoy due to erroneous intercept data. The Allied analysts compared the times and realized that the coordinates in the original signal from Collingsworth matched the false grid the Germans had followed. Someone had typed the wrong number. That was all. In the margin of the Western Approaches file, a clerk added a quiet note in blue ink. Enemy mispositioned owing to faulty Allied transmission. Cause unverified. That was the only official recognition the event ever received. For Dönitz, the loss was just one of many inexplicable failures that winter. He ordered his boats to shift south and blamed the weather, convinced that the enemy had developed new countermeasures. He could never have guessed that his defeat that week had been decided not by radar, not by cryptography, but by the tremor of a tired hand pressing a Morse key in a freezing cabin. The Battle of the Atlantic continued, claiming thousands more lives before it ended. Most records of Convoy ON 166 describe it as uneventful, a successful crossing with no losses. But among those who later studied the archives, the story became a quiet legend, a reminder that sometimes the smallest human flaw can overturn the most precise machinery of war. They called it the intercept that never was. And for once in that vast, merciless ocean, a single mistake had brought silence instead of death. Years passed before anyone began to understand what had really happened in the Atlantic that February. The war moved too quickly for small mysteries to matter. By the time peace returned, the world had new catastrophes to count, new heroes to remember, and new statistics to organize into history. Convoy ON 166 was logged in the archives as one of hundreds that had arrived safely. No one thought to ask why. It wasn't until the early 1950s, when Allied and captured German records were cross-examined by naval historians, that the pieces began to fit. In dusty files stored at Kew and Freiburg, researchers found parallel entries that mirrored one another like opposite reflections of the same silence. The Germans had written of a convoy that vanished. The Allies had written of a convoy that passed untouched. The dates matched, the grids matched, and the faint trail of signals between them, distorted, half lost and misread, told the rest. The report produced by the Admiralty's post-war analysis team was brief, almost detached. It concluded that a single navigational error in an outgoing transmission resulted in a gross displacement of the enemy interception line. That was all. No names, no circumstances, no speculation. Just one more footnote in the endless anatomy of war. But between the lines it was easy to sense the weight of what those words meant. An entire fleet had been spared because one man, worn thin by cold and exhaustion, had pressed the wrong key. For historians, the story became a quiet symbol of the Battle of the Atlantic, an episode that showed how randomness, fatigue, and human frailty could interfere with the machinery of destruction. In every account of submarine warfare, precision was everything. The mathematics of bearings, the physics of sonar, the geometry of interception. Yet here, for once, the equations had collapsed under something as unscientific as chance. The sea had absorbed the error, turned it into silence, and let it drift away. In Germany, the event was remembered differently. Within the Kriegsmarine archives, the logbooks of the Stürmer group were listed as unsuccessful, convoy lost to weather. None of the surviving officers ever learned the truth. When Dönitz was questioned after the war about the failures of early 1943, he said simply that the sea is full of mysteries. It was, perhaps, the only statement he ever made that needed no correction. As for the man who had caused the confusion, Harold Stevens never spoke of it. After the war, he worked briefly as a communications instructor in Halifax, then disappeared from public record. He died in the 1960s, buried under an unremarkable headstone, his name unknown to the history he had accidentally shaped. Those who sailed with him remembered only that he was quiet, quick with his radio set, and prone to warming his hands with a metal cup that smelled faintly of rum. When naval historians in the 1970s traced the convoy's course and compared it with declassified intercept data, they reconstructed the entire chain of events. One mistaken digit, one storm, one invisible detour in a sea too large to measure. It was an error so small that no one could ever have predicted its consequences, and yet it had saved over 1,000 men. The war had ended decades earlier, but the Atlantic remained the same, a vast indifferent stage where steel and willpower had met the random logic of nature. The sea had swallowed both victories and defeats, erasing them with equal precision. What survived were the stories, scattered like signals through static, barely audible, but still there if you listened long enough. Among them was this one, a reminder that even in the most mechanical and merciless of wars, survival could depend not on courage nor strategy nor destiny, but on a single imperfection in the hands of a tired man. The sea remembered him not with monuments or medals, but with silence. And in that silence, the echo of his mistake still drifts somewhere between the waves, carrying the quiet truth that sometimes, without meaning to, a man can save the world simply by being human.